there often is just a direct relation between a person's experiencing some event that was deeply humiliating, and destroyed his sense of self-esteem and adequacy as a man, and his resorting to violence. Let me describe one particularly, I think, illustrative example. When I was the medical director of the prison mental hospital in Massachusetts, the hospital for the so-called criminally insane or the violent mentally ill. But virtually everybody who committed a murder came through the hospital because the courts wanted a psychiatric evaluation before the trial. One day, a man was brought to the hospital to be admitted who was mute. He looked like the living dead. He was forlorn. He was somebody I couldn't interview because he was mute. And I had to rely on what the police report about him said, which was that he had just shot to death his wife and children. And over the next few days, he finally got to the point where he could talk and tell me his story. He had been a foreman in a factory, had a good job and a good income, and his wife was a school teacher who also had a good job and a good income. They each had a child by a previous relationship, but they were living together in a stable relationship. And then during the recession that occurred during the first President Bush's administration in the 1990s, he was laid off from his job, insisted he was laid off, not fired. That was important to him. That it wasn't that he was a bad worker, but he lost his job. And the company just didn't have enough money to pay him because of the recession. But he was so ashamed of what had happened that he couldn't add to the supporting his family, that he would get up in the morning and dress as if he were going to work and pretend to go off to work and come back at the end of the day as if he had been at work all day. And initially, while he was out, he'd be looking for another job, but there were no jobs because of the recession, and he would get refused again and again, and finally he gave up because it was just too humiliating to be rejected all the time. So he, finally his wife noticed that there was no money coming in, and so she confronted him and asked him what was going on. So he shamefacedly had to admit what was happening. Then she got very angry at him and said, "What kind of man are you? What kind of man would do something like this?" And so to prove to her what kind of man he was, he went into his bedroom and got his pistol out of the closet and shot her to death. And then the children were screaming, and to stop them from screaming, he shot them to death. And but he said that hadn't worked. He said he could still hear them screaming, and he thought he would hear them for the rest of his life. Now, to me, that was just an example of how an overwhelmingly humiliating experience can lead directly to violence, even though it's true that, a majority of people, most people who become unemployed, of course, are not that fragile. They're not, they don't become that desperate to kill themselves or other people or both. He said, by the way, that his original plan was to kill himself after he'd done this. And I asked him why he thought he hadn't done that. And he said, I'm already dead. That he felt dead inside. I mean, his whole personality was dead. And I think in a way that was true. When he came in, as I said, he looked like the Walking Dead. But even though this is rare, if only 1 in 100 people who has the experience of losing their job like this, if only 1 in 100 reacts that desperately, when you have a recession, you can have millions of people who lose their jobs, and you can have tens of thousands of people, committing homicide or suicide or both, who wouldn't do it otherwise.